So, look, sort of the morning here in many ways is provocation. It's to sort of get us thinking about this, and then we're going to dive into some really nice, interesting, fresh research that a bunch of people have coming out in the afternoon. But the next person that I want to welcome to stage is someone who is not a quantitative media analyst, but is someone who, using history, using deep ethnography, using a whole lot of personal experience, has written, I think, some of the most impactful and interesting work about propaganda, and specifically Russian propaganda. So I'm really thrilled to welcome to the stage Peter Pomeranzev.
I have no slides. I'm a bit petrified to be here. To put it mildly, I'm not from this world. I quit any kind of science, maths, social science at the age of 16, which you're allowed to do in England, with a huge joy. I was terrible at it. And being here is a bit like being pulled back into an exam, which I can't do when I'm 16. And every time somebody says qualitative or shows a graph, I have these terrible flashbacks to being really, really stoned in class, trying to understand what the teachers were talking about. My background, I studied literature, which isn't really a subject. Then after university, I went to Russia, and I went to film school in Moscow. And then I ended up making films in Moscow. So I've never thought about methodology. I've always thought about metaphors and camera movements and pretentious things like that. But while I was in Russia, and I was there almost 10 years, between 2000 and 2010, as I was traveling up and down the country and then working a little bit with some of the parts of the sort of the culture industry there and the media industry there, I began to kind of espy a new kind of social attitude and propaganda, which was kind of summed up in the title of a book that I then wrote about it, which again is a very pretentious piece of literary journalism called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. It was a book about Russia, about a culture where people didn't care about the truth anymore, where sort of conspiracy had taken over from ideology, where you couldn't really have any kind of rational debates anymore. And at the end of the book, I come back to the West, to Britain and America, and the book, which I wrote in 14, I think, kind of ends with this thought, oh my God, what if I saw in Russia is going to happen here as well? And it did. And now my book is having a tiny second life in America, where people go, hey, you can read this book about Russia, which is just about America as well. And so at one point, I realized that something very, very strange was going on in the world of media and propaganda. And I decided to take a step out of writing and filming. And I've ended up creating a little sort of think tank at the London School of Economics, where I try to bridge our two cultures, essentially. It was created by myself and other people who are very much from the world of culture and history and film. But we're trying to come together with data people to see if we can generate some solutions. So that's a quick background, and I'll dive into what I was asked to talk about, which is how has propaganda changed? So one of the little projects that we did when we launched our center at the LSE was to look at the history of Soviet desinformation, and Western responses to it, and see what is relevant today. So that's just what I'm going to focus on. I'm not going to talk about all of propaganda. I'm not going to get into Ellul, Adorno, all these big, academics that no doubt you've all read. But I'm just going to focus on this one little example of Soviet desinformation, what we did about it, and what's relevant now. So desinformation, for those of you who haven't been watching CNN over the last 6 months, is a very specific term in Soviet spycraft. Part of a broader thing called active measures, which was run by the KGB as a way to subvert the West. Not propaganda as in convincing them of the glories of the Soviet Union, but trying to undermine Western alliances, smear tactics, destroy credibility, and so on and so forth. And that was done through many, many tools. One of them was desinformation, which is spreading what Claire Wardle would never call fake news. Spreading hoaxes, conspiracies, various little stories. The most famous one that's always used as an example, and it's a good one, is the story that the CIA created the AIDS virus as a weapon against the African American population, which is a very, very big story that circulated for a very long time, and I'll be coming back to it. So what's changed from then until now? So the first big change. So back then, the Soviets had to use really quite sophisticated spycraft to carry out their desinformacja. They had to place agents of influence within Western newspapers. They had to carefully slip in these stories into the Western, and also not just the Western, I have to say. A lot of the time this was practiced in the non-aligned countries in Latin America and India, slip it into the local media, get it to become organic, create sort of, fairly sophisticated operations with scientists who would back up the various claims that they were making. It was like proper James Bond stuff. Yeah? Nowadays, the Kremlin obviously does a lot of this. Very recently I saw a story about how the CIA had invented Ebola as a weapon that was going around the Latin American internet. But they don't have to use any spycraft. And I think this is one of the first mistakes that we make when we think about Russian operations in America. This is not spies doing this. This is just a PR agency. They're just using Facebook. They look up what people want, how to target them, and they target them. There is absolutely no spycraft involved. They're completely going with the grain of the media system. They don't have to subvert it. They don't have to climb inside it. They're just using it like any digital marketing company would. So that's a pretty big change from Soviet times. Now, our paper, which I can send to you, which is very, very long, I'm just going to quote some extracts from it, was actually largely focused on what the West did in order to counter this disinformacja. So towards the late 70s, an institution was created to deal with this issue. At that point, there was like floods of this stuff coming out from the Soviet side, and it was called the Active Measures Working Group. And it was sort of an interagency group, including people from the CIA, the State Department, various other people. Now, the CIA had been very aware that the Soviets used disinformation for a long time. But this was sort of a moment when they came out and said, right, now we're going to talk about this publicly. This is an issue. We consider this a problem. That was the first really big step, to go out there and say, disinformation is an issue. I mean, we have something similar here. I mean, there's a lot of meetings in Brussels at the moment, at the EU, thinking, is disinformation even something we should be bothering about? Again, so what's the difference between now and then? Now it's very hard to see who would come out and say this, especially in America. I mean, you have a leadership that embraces the idea of disinformation. So that kind of leadership is completely absent. And also, they were saying something quite important in the late 1970s. They weren't talking about regulation, but they were saying there was a cultural norm around lying and not lying, that there is something wrong with disinformation, that we can pinpoint it and say, wow, this is a problem. At the moment, those kind of norms don't seem to exist, especially in America. And that's very noticeable in a lot of the discourse that I see in America. And maybe I'm wrong here, I'm watching it from London, where you sort of have to, because you can't say that disinformation is in itself a bad thing, yeah? You're left with this sort of rhetoric about Russian meddling, as if meddling is a category. It's not. We live in an open world where countries meddle with each other all the time. It's completely normal in an open world. So because there's no way of saying, oh, lies are bad, you're left with saying, oh, it's just because they intervened in our election. That's not a category. Meddling is not a category. Meddling is a completely subjective point of view. Again, I think this is slightly easier in the West, in Western Europe, sorry, you don't count America as the West anymore. In Britain, at least, we have Ofcom. We have a regulator which can catch Russia Today and other broadcasters out on being inaccurate. Yeah? So there's at least some sort of standard that you can judge things by without resorting to the bizarre language of meddling. So going on from that, so the main thing that the Active Measures Group did was discredit and debunk, basically. Yeah? They would take a Soviet hoax, and they would forensically show that the language that had been used in it showed that it was actually designed in the Soviet Union. There was one that I particularly liked. So there was a very, quite a successful sort of Soviet forgery, which tried to show during one of the Olympics that was being held in the US that the Ku Klux Klan were about to attack all the African African athletes. And there was a real chance that African athletes would not come to the US because of this hoax going round. And the Active Measures Working Group managed to show that the language used in this hoax was too good and too Anglo-English for any Ku Klux Klan guys to ever have written these threatening letters. Yeah, KGB spoke perfect English. American Hicks didn't. So again, fast forwarding to today, what would be the difference? Well, the Russians don't mind getting caught lying nowadays. That would be one of the main differences. Yeah, back then the Americans would say, hey, we found a Soviet hoax. And the Soviets go, no, we didn't do it. How embarrassing. Now, there doesn't seem to be a taboo around getting caught lying. I mean, when Vladimir Putin goes up on international TV and says to the whole world, as he did during the annexation of Crimea, there are no Russian soldiers in Crimea, he's not lying. He's not creating a hoax. He's not faking it. He's saying, facts don't matter. I lie, you lie, no one cares. There are no facts, there are no rules. And secondly, who would you deliver your forensic evidence to? I mean, back then, the Active Measures Working Group would do all this research and speak about it in Congress and deliver it to newspapers. And now they could probably very successfully deliver it to CNN. But that's not the audience that matters. What, they're going to start working with InfoWars and say, hey, InfoWars, we found a Russian hoax. It's not going to happen. The media market is so fragmented that it's unclear whether you would ever reach your target audience in proving that a hoax had been created. And also there's something else which I think is very important. Back then, the Soviet desinformация was created almost like a sort of a ready-to-wear piece of fashion. Yeah, now it's just mass-produced, just lie after lie after lie being sent forth. If you try to whack-a-mole every one of them, you're simply losing time. And the aim, half the time, isn't even to convince, it's to confuse. So again, I'm not entirely sure whether this forensic approach to debunking particularly works. Or it could work, but very narrowly. Now, getting away from the Active Measures Working Group, not only were the Americans trying to think about what to do about disinformация, the British were trying as well. Even as, the agencies that were meant to be dealing with this were actually penetrated by Soviet spies. But one of the useful things the British did was BBC monitoring. So essentially monitoring all the broadcasting put out by the Russians. This isn't just disinformация, this is actually broader. This is propaganda generally. And that was a rolling process where the BBC monitoring would have like hundreds of people sitting in this rather nice country house near Reading, and they would then give sort of almost weekly reports about what was going on in the propaganda and disinformation sphere. That would go to government ministries, and that would also go to the BBC World Service, various media, just to inform them of the field. Now, I think that's very, very useful, and monitoring is a very, very useful thing. I've tried to monitor a couple of elections recently where we were looking for various malign influence campaigns, a phrase I don't really approve of. But several things have changed. Firstly, back then, you could definitely tell that Russian propaganda or Soviet propaganda was Soviet propaganda. And you could usually work out that a piece of desinformация had been commanded and controlled by Moscow. Yeah? All active measures operations were approved and ticked off in Moscow, even if they were executed in various branches. Nowadays, there's a real, the broadcast model's changed. I mean, to put it very simply, there isn't just like the Kremlin beaming out its propaganda or command and controlling its desinformация. That's not what happens at all. I and a few other people in this room monitored the German election. Our brief had been to look at for Russian influence. There was some clearly Russian stuff, but there were also random mercenaries who quite liked Russia, who were doing it for a weird combination of fun and money. There was the international alt-right, which swarmed around the German internet, creating digital media campaigns on Discord and various closed groups. There was a Falun Gong sect that was pursuing the Russian and right-wing German line, immigrants are bad, Europe is terrible, Putin is great, simply because it was popular and there was a big market for it. And on top of that, they could layer in their Falun Gong propaganda. And it went on and on and on and on. So to think of some sort of clear Moscow KGB beaming in propaganda and desinformation into a Western space is absolutely absurd. Disinformation doesn't give a damn about geography. Information doesn't give a damn about geography. I think maybe not of the people in this room, but certainly in the mainstream media debate, we're using a bunch of 20th century sort of frames to think about a completely different field. I think one of the interesting stories has been with Hamilton 68. I don't know if you follow that. That's a dashboard set up by very, very, very clever tech people to show what are Russian bots doing in America. And they're usually doing stuff which is good for Trump and bad for everyone else. But if you look closely, and they admit this openly, they're not saying they're Russian bots. They're kind of a weird crowd of accounts which do vaguely pro-Russian stuff. Some are definitely Kremlin. We know that from the Congress analysis of which accounts were coming out of Moscow. But the rest of this kind of, these people that I just talked about, this weird mix of mercenaries and amateurs. And so it's kind of like Russian salad. They're not Russian. It's Russian salad. Russian salad, you get that anywhere. It's always a bit of mayonnaise. There's some attributions which are similar. But Russian salad in Brighton Beach or in Cambridge is not actually made in Moscow. It just has some similar attributions. There's also a delicious Spanish version. So again, the monitoring has changed completely. Yeah? So we're in a very, very different space. I'm very aware that I have only 9 minutes left. Okay, I think I'll do one more example of how things have changed. I was going to do a really... Okay, it's fine. Well, okay, going on in my menu of things. So one of the most powerful things that the West did in its battle against, and here I'm moving slightly away from disinformation into propaganda broadly, is set up these international broadcasters which beamed into Russia. And there was definitely a part of that which was about truth and lies as well, because there was Soviet censorship, and here these broadcasters like Radio Free Europe and stuff like that, they could sort of deliver the truth that the Soviets couldn't say. I won't dwell too long on them because it's slightly taking me out of the active measures area, but I think there's a couple of very, very important lessons from their activity. Firstly, they weren't like the BBC World Service, which tried to lecture people about how great Britain was across the world and what a wonderful power it was. These international broadcasters used local voices, and they used a very, for the time, I think, very interesting methodology of reaching the hidden listener. Understanding what do Russian audiences or Soviet audiences really want. So the methodology was you'd have these people from these international broadcasters hanging out at international trade fairs and at ports and bars, which was one of the few places where Soviet citizens could come abroad. And they'd approach them, either give them questionnaires to fill in, or just ask questions about, so what sort of news are you really into and what would you like to listen more of? This very, very sophisticated operation of gathering and understanding audiences. The reason I mention that is I do think there's a huge lesson to learn here. If we're going to start reaching people who are surrounded by misinformation and fake news and all these other things, then we're going to have to understand a lot more about them and start listening to them. Instead of lecturing them down, oh, here is the truth that we are beaming to you, you're going to have to use voices that they're ready to listen to, and you're going to have to understand more about them. The audience-driven approach to fact-checking, I think, is very, very important and something we're looking into at the LSE quite a lot. But again, there's a big change as well, because RFE and all these international broadcasters, they always, at the end of the day, offered more than just facts and truth. They offered the idea that there is an alternative way of being Russian or Ukrainian or the various constituent parts of the Soviet Union. They always raise this idea that somewhere there is a different way of doing things, an alternative. Now that's something that's completely disappeared, especially when we're talking to Russia. What the Putin propaganda has been very efficient as doing is destroying the idea that there is anything good outside of Russia. We're corrupt, they're corrupt. Yeah. We have inequality, they have inequality. And all their propaganda is based around this idea of destroying the idea that there is any alternative. Okay, I'm reaching the end of my long list of counter propaganda techniques and whether they're relevant today. I'll do one more, which is humor. So jokes were used very, very aggressively by the Western powers. So there was a CIA program to collect Soviet jokes, to publish them, and to broadcast them back to the Soviet Union. Now, those jokes, again, are very, very important because they're all about, well, all about different things, but the theme in them was catching the Soviets out on the difference between what they said was the truth and the reality of life. So it's, again, very much playing around this idea of, we deliver the truth. So a famous joke was, for example, a Russian guy, Civic guy is in the queue for sausages. It's a really long queue. There's no sausages in the shops. And he sort of says aloud, "Oh, damn this country, there's no sausages anymore." And a policeman next to him says, "Shush, shush, shush, shush." In previous times, you would have been shot for that. And he comes home, despondent, to his wife. And she says, "Oh, God, have we run out of sausages?" "Oh, it's much worse. We've run out of bullets." So all these jokes, they were again, weirdly enough, related to this idea of passing apart fact and fiction. Yeah? Now, of course, it's the other way around. Yeah? Humor has been weaponized by the alt-right, by Putin, who's very, very funny, and of course by Donald Trump, who's very, very funny, even though I guess it's not a joke living here at the moment. And it's because, they're the ones catching us out on our hypocrisy. "Oh, you liberals with your, highfalutin values, actually, blah, 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 blah." And you can always catch people out. And because they're not claiming to be achieving anything, Putin isn't claiming that he's achieving anything, you can't catch him out on any lies. There's no place to catch him out on. He's the troll. He's the one who can catch us out. So I guess what I'm moving towards is we seem to be in a sort of toxic mix of technology and culture. Yeah? We can have a conversation about which came first and how they inform each other, but they both seem to be happening at the same time. Sort of, if the counter propaganda against disinformatia was all based around the idea at the end of the day that the Soviets lied while the West told the truth. Yeah, you can critique that idea, but that's the kind of the philosophy behind it. That was the idea. We catch them out lying to show where the truth tellers. We have higher ideals and we have higher values. So there seems to be both a cultural breakdown with that, and at the same time there's a technological one where the technology seems to be geared around producing misinformation, producing echo chambers where facts and a rational conversation are rejected. So I'm going to end very quickly on thinking how come that's happened? Where has that happened? And the only conclusion that I can come up with is this, that in the Cold War, both the Soviets and the West were actually both involved in a fairly rational Enlightenment conversation about who had the better system and who had the better future. Yeah, the Soviet version, for me personally, maybe for some of you, was a very, very perverse version of that, but they were still trying to prove that they were getting somewhere. And when you're trying to prove that you're getting somewhere, you need facts, and you're offended when you get caught out lying. And the West obviously was trying to prove, no, our democratic capitalist system is better, and here are our facts, so we can win. So you could win with those arguments. Yeah? When the Cold War ends, there's no need anymore to win those arguments. I think in Russia, the future arrived much faster. There was complete disillusionment with communism, and very quickly complete disillusionment with democracy. By 96, people had lost their faith in most things. And when there's no kind of discourse about the future anymore, it's funny, that's the moment when facts kind of fall away. I mean, think about it. Facts are not pleasant things. Yeah? Facts tell you you're going to die, that you're overweight, that you're never going to be as rich as you want to be. Facts are not pleasant. Yeah? It's much more pleasant sort of to tear off the weight of facts. Yeah? Some sort of libidinal release. And that's what Putin gives, and I think that's what Trump gives as well. That's why I think the problem that I had when I came back from seeing this Russia where nothing is true and everything is possible, and I came back to the West, in America especially, and saw the same thing happening here, I do think the processes are deeply related. They're all a slow fallout from the end of a kind of future-oriented project where you have to prove that you have the better facts. And then you can catch out the other side lying. So what does that mean? I mean, it's okay because we've formed this little thing at the LSE, and we're going to sort all this out. And I see a lot of other people who, unlike me, clearly come from, they stayed in class and did science, but we all seem to be converging around one point. How do we harness technology in order to create a discourse where people are talking to each other? How do we start generating, I don't like the word narrative, I think it feels a bit 20th century. How do we start generating an arena where facts are necessary again? Yeah? I think that will always be tied to some sort of version of the future in progress. So one of the things that we're looking at the LSE is trying to investigate how you can use constructive news, yeah, much more powerfully. So not just present the news as facts or as opinions, but arrange the way you talk about news so people are drawn into a conversation of how it can be used to improve their lives. I came back from the Balkans recently, which, again, is one of these places which is just rife with conspiracies and fake news. I talked to a fact checker in Serbia, and I was like, how's the fact checking going? He's like, we don't have a concept of the truth in our politics. I can't check anything. No one cares. Very interesting. So people come up with these, conspiracy theories, nostalgia. I think it's not a coincidence that Putin is a nostalgist and Trump is a nostalgist. Yeah. When the idea of the future and a fact-driven discourse disappears, nostalgia is what replaces it, which is by its nature dreamy and fact-free. So is there a moment to the Serbian guy? Is there a moment when people do start talking about reality, when they do start having to prove arguments, talk about the facts, engage with each other? He said, yeah, when they talk about their children. The minute you start saying, what do you want to do with their children, suddenly, wow, you have this rational, constructive conversation. 0. I ended on the children. That's so good. That was the end of the thought. I'd leave it hanging there.
You're not getting off that easy. So thank you. That's incredibly helpful. And I want to ask Peter a couple of questions, but I guess I want to start by asking the first question, which is why, right? So why is it so to the advantage, not just for Putin, but for the alt-right, for everybody else, to confuse? So to put it in the language that I tend to talk about, and we were talking about this morning, who benefits from mistrust? Who wins in this ecosystem where there's no one really fighting for truth, and instead we're sort of in this nostalgic post-truth world? Why is this something that is so good for Putin, and why is this such a popular active strategy?
So let's just stick with Russia. I don't feel comfortable lecturing Americans about America. I feel like Americans who've always lectured Russians about Russia. It's wrong. So firstly, look, we can just look at the history. And several people in this room actually worked on a beautiful MIT mapping of the Russian internet circa 2010. And you can see all the different bits, the nationalists, the neo-Stalinists, bless them, the liberals, the feminists, all talking with each other. It's a really engaged space. The Kremlin had let the internet drift away. It only was obsessed with TV. And then you have this massive flourishing of protest movements around 2011, 2012, which brought together really very, very different movements, from really scaring nationalists, but who do want social change, through to the 3,000 types of hating each other liberals. And it all lived on LiveJournal. It wasn't on Twitter then. And this incredible debate with its own language, its own ideas, very future-orientated with economic programs, and Putin had to destroy it. Now, what authoritarian leaders have worked out, and it's not just Putin, is that you can't really do censorship anymore because people will get around it. So instead of doing censorship, you just blanket the space with so much disinformation. People can't see the wood for the trees and get confused. There's even Sergei Guriev, who's now the chief economist at EBRD, even came up with a formula of how much disinformation you need to real information in order to confuse groups. This isn't just Russia. This is China, Turkey. This is now just a tactic. So there's that, and which actually raises a very interesting, provocative question about, does that mean that too much bad information is actually a form of censorship and an attack on free speech? Which I think is an interesting thing to think about. Because the claim they always use is free speech. When you go, hey, you're spreading all these lies, free speech. But it's being used to censor people, actually. So there's that. There's just like the convenience of that. But there's also, what's changed in the Russian discourse? is it moved away from ideology, Soviet Union is great, therefore you must be killed in the name of the people, to conspiracy. And the conspiracy theories on Russian TV are everlasting. They don't end with, oh, the Jews did it all. It's like a Matryoshka doll. Ah, it's the Jews did it all, but actually they're controlled by Obama, and he's actually controlled by the Masons, and he's actually controlled by... So you live in this world of conspiracies where you can't find the truth. The first thing the Kremlin does, when there was a genuine protest movement against it, obviously it said, they're being paid by America. That's not interesting. It said, no, they're being paid by us. We control this protest movement, and we're using it to test people in society. Yeah? Destroy trust in anything. Everything is a conspiracy. And something weird happens in that world when you live in a world of conspiracies. Firstly, you feel you can't change anything. Because if you can't get to the truth ever, then you can't change anything. Then you need some sort of strong hand to guide you through it. Yeah? A Putin or a whatever. So there's that bit of it. And also, I guess it's pleasurable. I guess there's some sort of pleasure. I'm not the first person to say this. You can blame the fact that your wife left you or that your career didn't work on Obama.
So are you saying for me personally?
No.
I've had a really rough couple of years, and it was under Obama. But I'm doing much better now. Thank you. Anybody want to ask Peter a question, and then we're yes. Hello, Yohai. We really are close to lunch, I promise.
It's less a question and more a pushback on you, Ethan. Yeah. If the attack, if the source of epistemic crisis is an effort to get us to believe that nothing is true, we are complicit when we keep saying that there's a moment of postmodernity where people don't know, or there's lack of interest in... There's no lack of interest in truth. Fact Check and PolitiFact and Snopes are full of people on the center and the center left who want to read them. CNN is not like Fox News. There's a continuous checking function and a rich audience. We have roughly 50-some% who are really interested in facts and fact-based argument, and we have roughly high 40% who really don't want it and are perfectly happy to live in a disinformation-rich world. And as long as we keep studying and repeating that there's a single phenomenon, as opposed to that there's a politically, historically rooted differentiation with very clear winners and losers politically, we simply help the narrative that we're in a disinformation moment. We're not.
Well, I think Poland and Hungary are very interesting to look at that way. But instead, so as long as Poland and Hungary had this very, very simple future-oriented narrative getting into the EU, which you needed really simple, boring facts for to prove that you had to restructure your economy, do lots of reforms on your military, you had to do these really boring but very clear path of reforms. Their politics were dominated by a factor of narrative. It was relatively rational and relatively evidence-based. They get into the EU, a potom что, and then what do you do next? The idea of the future disappears, and there's this rise of these conspiracy thinking, whatever, postmodern, if you want to call it that, in the sense that truth really doesn't matter in their rhetoric, nostalgia-driven politicians, Kaczynski in Poland and Orban in Hungary. So it is. I think postmodernism has been overused so much of the term, I have no idea what it means anymore. But we do see these kind of moments of where sort of the arena for, someone used the word public sphere, I know it's a controversial idea, but it was there and then it disappeared. And we can sort of see that moment quite often. We haven't got on to Britain yet.
I just wanted to comment on Yochai's comment that even your low 50s, high 40s, something Peter said in passing, that even in those 40s, that group asked them about their children, asked them about things in the here and now, and there isn't a person who doesn't care about the facts. So I think there is this kind of dismissiveness about large portions of the population as just not caring about facts, and I think there is very few human beings who happily will be fed bullshit, which is really the phenomenon of Frankfurt's definition of bullshit, is what I think you're centering on, that it's about issues that are not grounded. where the conspiracies can keep flying. But when it's your kids, it's different. It's just a super important point, how to tap into that and build off of that.
But just to sort of frame this tension, because it is going to come up through our conversation, one of the things that Yochai and Rob and others have argued for in the paper that they'll be presenting this afternoon is asymmetric polarization, where there is evidence that there is far more embrace of disinformation on the right than on the left. What you're getting from Deb and a little bit from me is the fear that this might be an environment that this could happen on the left and the right. And from Deb, I think the hopeful view that when you reframe this in terms of your kids, as Peter is saying, that there's a way to sort of sort through this. But this was all my way to get over to David Karger.
Hi, David Karger from IT. So I stopped studying the humanities about the same time as you stopped studying the sciences, but I'm hoping you can extract something sensible from this question. Some of what you were talking about put me in mind, actually, of the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, when people were sort of closed-minded, afraid of the unknown, swamped in superstition and folk remedies and so on and so forth. And you know, as a scientist, we think, oh, then the Enlightenment happened. And all of a sudden, everybody realized that it was about facts and checking the truth of things and verifying knowledge and so forth. So my question is, you know, are we headed back to the Middle Ages? And perhaps can we figure out what allowed the Enlightenment to win in the past few hundred years that we might be able to leverage to sort of re-enlighten the communities that are currently trying to go backwards?
And please let the answer not be that we have to establish a foundation of all knowledge on a distant planet and protect it for more than 10,000 years, because that's been done.
Right, I mean, I don't know if it was such a smooth path to the Enlightenment. You know, the appearance of the printing press, you know, was very, very disruptive. In the language of today's alt-rights, who I'm spending far too much of my time reading, it was a case of the Red Desert rising up against the Blue Church. That's how some members of the alt-right intelligent, huh? The Red Insurgents. See, another friend from 4chan. Red Desert is nicer though, but yeah, okay. The Red. So I mean, it was you know, when you know the church's hold on knowledge broke. Yes, it brought the Enlightenment, but first it brought sort of 30 years of war in the wars of religion. So again, you know, when new communication technologies arrive, I think it can be quite a bumpy ride. You know, radio was seized on by totalitarian regimes. TV was first seized on by McCarthy. It takes a while for you know, more noble forces to use these technologies. It's very interesting looking at the history of the BBC. That was a response to technology. Oh my God, this new technology has appeared. How do we start, you know, trying to use it for the public good in a very, very patrician, you know, controlling way, one has to say. I don't think we'll return to that again. I don't think you know, I don't think it'll be a top-down process, simply just by the nature of the media. I don't know. We're all here to solve this in 2 days, so I don't have an answer quite yet. But you know, we're just trying to experiment a little at the LSE and see where we end up.
We're going to take 2 more questions back here, Peter, and then we'll...
Yeah, I hope it's okay. I'm a bit jet lagged, so that's why I sat down.
Two more, and then we'll for you, I promise.
Yeah, I found your talk really interesting, but I think the most interesting part to me was the fact that you said all this confusion and disinformation starts to act as censorship. And I've been thinking a lot about Chinese censorship. I use WeChat and all these things, and they're so effective at closing down uprisings because there's a combination of censorship, distraction in culture, and also just killing any group movements. Have you seen in your own work, how does the stuff that you're studying, the confusion, relate to mass censorship? I just find that connection interesting.
I think you just said it all. I don't have that much to add to what I said. Maybe I will in a second. Maybe I'm getting tired. Is there something in particular that you're interested in? I thought you read. There's great papers by Professor King of Harvard, your
Yeah,
neighbor.
yeah.
I've read those. They're brilliant. I quote those all the time.
No, I was just wondering if there was anything in the attitude or like in this Russian misinformation, how, if you see any mechanism where it works together more or anything to add.
One way to look at this might be to say that you gave the history of the Russian infosphere really sort of moving into LiveJournal, which was a highly uncensored space with closed communities. And closed communities are part of why WeChat has been so successful. And your diagnosis was basically you have to flood the zone. Because unless you have censorship built into those tools at a very deep level to control certain conversations happening there, which has happened with WeChat and Weibo and such, you might actually have to sort of salt the entire field. And you could make the same argument for Twitter in Turkey, where in fact what ended up happening, and here I'm working on Zeynep Tufekci's work, once Twitter became so useful for organizing the Gezi Park protests, what you saw at that point was essentially Erdogan's attempts to delegitimize the whole space.
So there was a moment, I can't pronounce the name, Zeynep Tufekci's work, so I can't pronounce it properly. But I was so relieved when I saw the essay that was published recently, because it's something that I'd been seeing for a long time and had always been actually too afraid to say, because you end up saying free speech might be bad for you, which kind of goes against all my journalistic instincts. But I remember being in the Baltics, and this was the time of the Crimean crisis and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we were trying to think about how you could create, I was working with the foundation, trying to think how you can create sort of more accurate media for the local Russian-speaking population in the Baltics. Now, they're not really a Russian-speaking population. Most people there are bilingual, and they have no problem with access to media. Yeah? They have Western media, Russian media, independent media, 5 different types of Telegram channel. They don't have a problem with access to media. It's not a censorship issue in that classic way. But their attitude was like, look, we know everyone's lying. The Americans are lying. The Russians are lying. We're not stupid. We know Putin's lying about the war. But they lie in such an entertaining way that we watch the Russian channels. And it was funny. So it turned out that when you just had like a libertarian approach to information, it didn't necessarily lead to better decision-making, better debates, more informed public sphere. It actually led to people going, oh, bugger it, I'm just going to watch these hilarious Russian shows that we're having about kind of Ukrainians crucifying Russian children, these ridiculous stories. That was a real shock to me because, going back to the Cold War was the victory of open information over closed systems. And now the Putins of the world have reversed that. They've realized, okay, there's actually a way to use open information against it. And that's a massive challenge for us. I mean, again, I was just in the Balkans. And the liberals in the Balkans were told, here is your formula for a good media space. A public broadcaster, a competitive market. And what was the other one? There's something else. Anyway, well, those 2 things have been completely hacked. So all these countries, Serbia, bits of Bosnia, they all have public service broadcasters, but they've all been kind of secretly taken over by the state. And they do have like a free market for media. But there's so much shenanigans behind the scenes that you can only advertise in newspapers or TV that's favorable of the leadership. Yeah? So on paper, they have done everything. Yeah? They have a free market for media, and they have a public service broadcaster, and it's completely buggered. So when the nice sort of, people who like truth and all these things, and in the Balkans, I was like, so what do we do next? And they're like, we don't know. These are the formulas you gave us for a healthy media space. They don't work anymore. And we have absolutely nothing to tell them but like, well, try reforming your public broadcaster again. I mean, the system's completely been hacked. Those ideas have been completely hacked. And for those of us who work in sort of media development and all this kind of stuff, which I occasionally moonlight in, it's a complete crisis. We have no idea about how to fix it.
Let's go over to Joan for a last question.
Okay, it's more of a comment than a question. But one of the things that I also don't want to lose track of as we evolve our thinking about this is that we are dealing with corporations. And so I'm thinking about Kate Kalanick's work on the new governors. And if I had my chance to write a paper like that. I'd probably call it the reluctant governors. So I encourage people to start thinking about these platforms as territories where there is a battle for information and a battle for attention playing out. And the way that it's being framed related to these white supremacist troll groups is very 2011-ish, around we can use these tools to do direct to consumer marketing of our ideas. And so this idea of the red insurgency is basically to suggest that these corporations are too slow, because they're organizations, to make decisions. And so all we have to do is leverage the time of a breaking news crisis or of a data void in order to get our information moving. And then the moment they try to intervene, that's where we can double down on the spread of that information and say, oh, now these platform companies are censoring us. Now it's part of a global conspiracy. And so because there isn't an upfront set of policies and ways of working with disinformation, they really leverage those crisis events to do these insurgent tactics. And so let's not lose track of the fact that there's millions and billions of dollars at stake in keeping this information online and keeping those users' attention part of the flow of the platform and the user-generated content as well. Thanks.
So everyone, thank you so much for some great conversations, some great questions. Here's where we are at this point. We have lunch. You are under strict orders from me to sit with someone you haven't met before. We've given you enough to talk about. If you haven't had enough to talk about, clearly you're more jet lagged than Peter is. After lunch, we are going to break up into 2 tracks. One is in this room, one is in the lecture hall right next door. My strong suggestion, maybe my plea to you, is if you have a device with you, tweet about this, use that EMEMIT hashtag. There's a very, very good conversation going on there. That's one of the better ways that we can try to keep track of the 6 papers in each of those tracks, because I know that, like most of you, I want to be in both of those rooms simultaneously. But in the meantime, lunch is right behind you. Thank you to everyone who's spoken, to everyone who's asked a question. Thank you all for being here, and we're going to call you back into session at 1 p.m.